In this video, I want to talk about block level elements versus inline elements. If you'd like to follow along with the video, you can download the demo files I will link to. They can be found on my GitHub repository called Block. Block level elements are elements like the paragraph tag, div tag, header tags, many of the newer HTML5 tags like article or section, and the list tags. Block level elements are formatted with a line break before and after their contents, making them stand alone. They take up the width of their containers. Inline elements include elements like the M tag, strong, anchor links, span, button, image, and the input tags for forms. Inline elements only take up the width of their contents. They do not begin on a new line. Usually they'll appear inside of block level elements, like inside of a paragraph. If you want a full list of the different types of elements, I recommend the Mozilla Developers Network reference, which is where my definitions come from. When I was first learning CSS, I didn't pay enough attention to these definitions. It seemed obvious enough, so I sort of glossed over really understanding what the differences were. As a result, other slightly more advanced concepts like the box model, floats, and positioning became harder to understand. In this demo, we'll look at how the different types of elements behave in the browser when you style them with CSS properties. I'll be using the Adobe Brackets editor so we can use a live preview as I make changes to the HTML and CSS. I have an index.html, styles.css, and an image file in my demo folder. If we look at the HTML, you can see that it is slightly strange markup with several empty elements like the header, nav, and footer areas. I did that on purpose so we can move things around and see what happens on the page. In the CSS, I have removed all margins and paddings. I've also set different background colors on the elements so we can see what's really happening on the page. You can see the body has a very light gray and the wrapper div has a white background. The block level elements have a medium gray background and the inline elements have a light teal behind them. Right now the block level elements all look like they're in one big mass because I've removed the margins. I'll add a 5-pixel margin to the bottom of the block level elements. Now we can see the white background of the wrapper in between them. Let's look at the HTML again. I have some highlighting in my editor turned on called Live Preview Highlight so that we can see where all these elements are. Live Preview will highlight the different tags when my cursor is inside of a tag, either in the HTML or CSS. I'll be turning this on and off throughout the demo because it can be helpful but also annoying. Notice that when I select an element that's empty, a block level element, it's just showing a line, so this element has no height. But when I select an element with contents, it has height. It's showing a rectangle. The height of the block level elements, when it's not specified in your CSS, is the height of the contents. Also notice that the width of all the block level elements is the width of the parent container. In this case, the parent of all these items is the wrapper div, which has a 500 pixel width and a padding of 1 em. So all these elements are spanning the full width of the wrapper div, even those that have no height. When we get down to the inline elements, the span, em, strong, anchor, and image tags, the inline elements are only taking up as much space as they need. They are only as wide as their contents. Now I'm going to add some padding to the block level elements. Notice that even the empty block level elements are showing up now. The padding is giving those blocks some height even though we haven't specified a height. They all have a height of at least 10 pixels. Those that have content in them have more because the height is dependent on the content. And if I put content in the empty elements by moving things around, you'll notice how they grow to fit the content plus the 5 pixels of padding. So now I have 3 main sections, the header, the main div, and footer. All the other content fills up these block level elements. Let's look more at the inline elements now. I'll give them some padding. Notice how the padding is added on all sides, but the container of these elements does not grow taller. See how the background of these elements is even covering up some of the text in the paragraphs because the container is not growing. That's because these elements are in line. If I change the top and bottom padding to 0 but leave the right and left at 5 pixels, it looks better. So you can add padding on all sides of an inline element, but it is not going to change the height of the parent container. There is one exception though. Notice the image. I'll add back 10 pixels to the top and bottom so it's really obvious. The padding on the top and bottom of the image does affect the height of the parent. So the image tag is an exception to the rule because the browser knows the image needs to fit into whatever block it's inside of. I'll go back to 0 so it looks better. Do you see this empty teal box down here? That's from all the empty inline elements I have in the HTML. It's from the right and left padding. If I remove the padding, the box will go away. So again, with padding, the right and left padding on inline elements will affect the box size. The top and bottom will not, unless it's an image. But the block level elements, the padding on all 4 sides, affects the height and width of the box. Now let's look at how margin will affect these elements. We already had a bottom margin of 5 pixels, but if I add 10 pixel margin to all 4 sides, you can see how all the boxes grow. And the spacing between the block level elements grows as well. When I add a margin to all 4 sides of an inline element, however, it's really only adding the margin to the right and left of these elements. Again, the image acts differently. The image has a margin on top and bottom. I'll comment that out again so you can compare the difference. Like padding, adding a margin to inline elements will not change the height of the parent container. So you can add top and bottom padding to inline elements, but not top and bottom margins. Neither one will change the height or the flow of the parent container. Now I'd like to talk about adding height to these elements. If I just generically add a height to the block level elements, I'll mess up the look completely. That's because the parent containers, like the header tag or the div with a class of main, will only be 100 pixels, and that's not going to be enough space to contain all these children that also are 100 pixels tall. So instead, I can add heights to individual elements like the block quote. Now the block quote has more space than it needs, so we have all this extra space below it. And if I add a height to the footer, we get the same result. Let's try adding a height to the inline elements. Notice the height is only affecting the image. It resizes the image to 50 pixels, but all the other inline elements are not affected by the height property at all. And finally, let's try adding a width to these elements. I'll add a 70% width to the block level elements. Notice how they all shrink. The block quote is messed up because the text won't fit in the height I've given it, so I'm going to comment that out. With the inline elements, I'll try adding a width of 30 pixels. Notice again, only the image has changed. If I toggle the width on and off, you can see only the image tag is being changed. Actually, the image has become distorted because we have a width and a height set, and the proportions are different. We need to use only one of these properties to resize the image, so I'll comment out the height. So the takeaway here is that the image tag is considered inline because it does not start on a new line and fill the width of the container like a block level element would. But it doesn't behave in exactly the same way as other inline tags like strong, M, or span. Those inline properties will take up the width of their contents, and their width can be changed with padding and margin, but they remain in line inside of their parent container. The final thing I want to talk about is how you can change this property of elements. The property you want to change is the display property. First, I'd like to remove the width on the block level elements. Now I'll change the LI tags to be inline instead of block. Notice how they're all on one line now. And if I try to give them a height or width, nothing will change. However, I can give them a margin or padding to give more space on the right and left. If I set a background, we can see the padding, and I can even increase it on all sides. It will show more white, but it won't make the parent container any larger. Now let's try making all our inline elements block instead of inline. Let me remove the width off of the block elements first. See how each of these elements now starts on a new line, and it also takes up the entire line? That's the difference between inline and display level. Hopefully this has helped you understand the concept of display level blocks versus inline a little bit better. The best thing you can do is just play with these concepts and try things in your browser. If you'd like to read a little bit more explanation, I would recommend reading these two articles. This article on Impressive Webs is a nice simple explanation of the differences between the two. And if you want to get even deeper, I would suggest reading the Chris Coyer article on the box model at csstricks.com.